Do you mind holding it instead of clipping it? If ever the audience, because I know sometimes it's a big venue, so if you can hold it. Last option.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this talk today. It's always a wonderful treat for us to welcome back someone who's become a good friend of summer school, Professor Thuli Madonsela. I think we did this show last year. It shows that we still have these challenges with ethical leadership and good governance. The struggle continues. So it's really my pleasure to welcome Thuli. She doesn't really need an introduction. She's very well known to all of us. I just should mention that, again, I think Thuli and I met more than 20 years ago when she was in the Department of Justice, chief director there on the gender desk, and we worked together for a number of years on human rights. And Thuli has consistently been an advocate for human rights and social justice. And of course, we know the incredible work that she did as public protector. And it's really a testament to what an individual can do. I mean, when we think about the Office of the Public Protector at the time that Thuli occupied that position, we remember that it inspired so much trust, hope, optimism, and of course had a huge impact on what happened in our country and what is presently happening, certainly within the Zondo Commission. That's really the direct result of the work that Thuli's office and Thuli herself did in the Office of the Public Protector. And today, sadly, when we think about the Office of the Public Protector, there's a very different feeling that we have, which just gives you an idea that we should never underestimate the change and impact that an individual can make when they are principled, when they're consistent in speaking truth to power. So Thuli, as you know, is now a professor at the University of Stellenbosch. I don't know how they got in there before us. Okay. And of course, Thuli has her own foundation, the Tuma Foundation, that works with young people, instilling values around ethical leadership and the role that they can play as active citizens. So Thuli will be speaking today on the challenges around ethical leadership and good governance in our present context. And she said that she's quite happy after the talk. I think she'll speak for about 20 minutes, 25 minutes, and she'd be happy to engage with you once she's done, take questions, comments, and we will finish at 2. At 2. Okay. So we have approximately about half an hour for so Thuli, welcome. Okay.
Thank you, Professor Ali. Thank you, dear colleagues, for the opportunity to be back here this afternoon. And to the colleagues in this room, Happy New Year and happy next decade. We started this year on a high note, and it was because it was a new year. Everyone starts on a high note in the new year, at least on the 1st of January. And the high note was also because it's a new decade. And why do we celebrate a new year and a new decade or a new day? Is because always in our heads we tell ourselves, finally, possibly, on this day, I'll get it right, they'll get it right, we'll get it right, and everything is going to be better. I wonder whether that was your experience in terms of what has happened this year. But many people that I've met have felt like that. But today is only the 17th of January. And when I read newspapers, the narrative seems to be, who stole our dawn again? Is that your impression? That we're back to that. First 2 days of January were all happy, new resolutions, new decade, and everything was going to get better. And then suddenly we're back to, what happened to our dawn? We know that dawn is a beautiful moment because it offers us hope that things will be better. But what? Who stole our dawn? Last year, when I spoke to this group, and when I speak to many groups, I ask who stole our dawn. Most people think the president did. Is that your view too, that the president stole our dawn? He's not leading enough. For example, other people feel that this whole question of the land issue, the idea of the president saying he wants to prioritize fixing the constitution by the end of the year, that's a joy stealer. And because we don't want that to happen, but probably the reality is that if it has to happen, the sooner it does, the better, because then we know what our chances are. Well, others think all political parties have stolen our dawn. And those who are working in companies that have retrenched them, or they've retrenched their relatives or their friends, they think the people who have stolen the new dawn are the captains of industry. So everyone blames someone for stealing the new dawn. But one thing my mother taught me when I was growing up was that the most helpful hand you will ever find in life is the one at the end of your arms. And I suspect that's how everyone in this room has lived their lives. That's why we have adapted, because it's often mistaken when we think that Charles Darwin said, those who survive are the fittest. He meant those who are strongest will survive. And the reality is that those who adapt to the environment are the fittest. We're here because those before us adapted to the environment, and we're here because we have adapted to our environment and made it work for us. And therefore, if the dawn has to be saved, who is to save it? It's us. Do you agree? But how? Well, it seems to me that the issue of ethics is one of the reasons this dawn keeps being elusive. The issue of ethical governance and the issue of ethical leadership. And I want to engage you very briefly with what is ethical governance, what is ethical leadership, what has gone wrong, and what can we do about it, me and you. And hopefully I won't take too much time so that I leave more time to engage, because in Zulu they say the best loincloth is the one that is sewn in public, because we all contribute to the design, we all contribute to the sewing, and we get the best one. And hopefully we are going to get the best one here over our discussion on how are we going to make sure that 2020 is 20 plenty. You know, young people have come up with that idea. 2020 is 20 plenty. Yes, well, how do we make 2020 20 plenty for everyone? And how do we make the next decade really, truly our decade, particularly for this continent? We've always said this is our time. And I hope, finally, this is our time. And that the next 10 years are the best years this continent has ever experienced, and this country has ever experienced. This country has experienced some good years, particularly in the first few years of democracy. I hope you agree with me that we had good years. Can we recapture that spirit? How do we find it? And how do we make this one too a good one? Firstly, if we're going to discuss ethical governance and good governance, maybe we should just come together around the meaning of the concepts that we work with. Ethics is defined by the Oxford Dictionary as the moral principles that govern a person's behavior or the conducting of an activity. So it's the moral principles that would determine how do you conduct nursing, how do you govern if you are in a governance space, how do you do your lawyering if you're a lawyer, how do you conduct yourself if you're a school teacher. It's just those kinds of moral principles that will determine what is right and what is wrong in terms of behavior. And the Cambridge Advanced Learners Dictionary says ethics refers to a system of accepted beliefs that control behavior. At the end of the day, really is about what's right and what's wrong. And the deeper question that arises all the time, though, is what's the source of ethics? Where do I find the playbook on ethics? What if there's a gray area? What if there's a moral dilemma? It's not clear what is right and wrong. What do I do? I hope you agree with me that part of the reason dawn keeps coming and going, or looking a little bit gray, or looking a little bit like dusk, is the question of ethics. And if we can all agree on what's right and wrong, and where do we find the definition of right and wrong, I hope we're going to do better. My view is the key source of ethics is going to be the Constitution. But let's start with governance if we're going to look at ethical governance and good governance. Governance is the process through which state and non-state actors interact to design and implement policies within a given set of formal and informal rules that are shaped by power. That's the World Bank report on governance and the law says that. So governance, it's a process through which state and non-state actors interact to design the rules of engagement or policies, which, of course, at the end of the day become rules of engagement, and the processes for implementing the same. And a lot of this is about how do we use power, particularly entrusted power, properly. There's a difference between government and governance. And often people inside government have a paradigm of government, not a paradigm of governance. And democracy requires governance. So governance means there's a role for non-state actors and there's a role for state actors. Our role as citizens is not just to put a tick on the balance, a cross on the ballot box and disappear. We have a right to participate in determining what the policies will be. We have a right in determining what the laws should be and which laws should be revised. And we also have a right to ask questions about how laws are being implemented or not implemented. If I look at, for example, 5th century Athens when democracy started, do you know that citizens were so engaged? When you talk about active citizens, they were so engaged that they noted day to day whether those who were entrusted with state power were implementing the laws. You would be removed just for not implementing a law. You would be removed, you would be killed. Well, I'm not advocating anybody getting killed. I found it weird, actually, that in 5th century Athens, when people in government were not doing the right thing, they could be killed, because in Zambia, there's a tribe where they did the same thing. If you didn't do the right thing, because they didn't have any elections, the kingship, the succession to the throne was hereditary. So the only way we could get another person into place was if you were gone. But thank God that we don't have to do that, because now in democracy we can remove you. But in Athens, well, eventually they stopped killing people and they removed them regularly. But over the years, they found that though, if we remove people too soon, then we remove them before they've had an opportunity to use the wisdom from making mistakes and doing it better. And therefore, there's wisdom behind the idea of 5-year elections, although I do think we have to reconsider that as well and think maybe after 2.5 years we could consider a mini election where we don't remove everyone, we remove some people. And to keep democracy going, this sounds like a joke, dear colleagues, but there's many people in our society, not just in South Africa, in the whole world, who say they don't want democracy. But the truth is, what they don't want is undemocratic practices. So what they call the sins of democracy are not the sins of democracy. They're sins of undemocratic practices that are sold to the nation as democracy. For example, if you make policies and you don't involve people, that's not democratic, because democracy is a Greek word that is a combination of demos and kratos. Demos is the people, kratos is power. So it's people's power, people's rule. And if the people are only participating at the level of the ballot box, that can't be power. That can't be rule. Because even the World Bank report that I've referred to right now talks about power being really the ability to influence decision. So you can't say democracy is people's power if at the end of the day people feel totally excluded from deciding what is to be done and what shouldn't be done, and what should happen to those who don't do the right thing. And ultimately, we could say governance is the way organizations are managed at the highest level and the systems for doing this. And therefore, governance is not just governance at the level of a country. We govern our churches are governed, our stokvels or societies are governed, our clubs are governed. There's a governance system which is really about the rules of running the organization and the systems for making sure that everything is done in accordance with the rule. And at the end of the day, governance is a system for managing entrusted power. Because we can't all do things, we can't all be everywhere. There has to be rules on who does what, and how do we make sure that whatever is done is for the benefit of the members of the whole. If it's a small society and the members of the country as a whole, that's why we talk about public interest, which is the interest of all of the people. So we've spoken about governance, but then if you add good governance, that's supposed to be extra. It's sort of extraordinary. Governance ordinarily is just the rules. It's just the rules and the system of managing an organization or a country. But when it's good, there has to be something into it. And for me, good governance is governance of an organization or state in a manner that ensures compliance with the regulatory framework while meeting people's needs and fostering constitutionalism. And good governance needs ethical leadership. Do you agree with me? That there can't be good governance. You can't govern in a manner that meets the needs of everyone. You can't govern in a manner that complies properly with the regulatory framework. You can't govern in a manner that respects the principles of constitutionalism if there isn't ethical leadership. There's a difference between compliance and malicious compliance. For example, let's look at what people call tax evasion, which companies don't call tax evasion. But that's people complying with tax laws. I was reading something that was showing that the biggest companies in the US pay very little tax compared to an ordinary citizen. So according to their lawyers, they're complying with the laws. But it is not the kind of compliance that is substantive. The same thing with the Constitution. In the last few years, particularly during the years when I was a public protector, a whole lot of people complied with the letter of the Constitution, but not with the spirit. For example, you make a decision against someone and then they're supposed to comply, and then they take a small issue. They're not saying, did I do the right thing or did I do a wrong thing? Instead, they're saying, do you have the power to judge me? So in a properly run organization, I wouldn't be concerned about, do you have a power to judge me? I would say, are you judging me properly in terms of what I'm supposed to do with the power you've entrusted me with? Because everyone in the public is my employer if I work for government. including those who are in government and those who are outside government. And if they ask me questions, it shouldn't be a question of who are you? It should be a question is there sense, is there substance in the questions you are raising, and is there anything I can do to reflect on my behavior to comply with that? And that's what is constitutionalism about. It's really about complying with the spirit of the Constitution, which is making sure that our acts, our behavior, our policies yield to the kind of democracy that was envisaged by the architects of our democracy. So if everyone does their own thing and they run around, they go to court 1,000,000 times to avoid accountability, that might be compliance with the law, but it's not constitutionalism, because they are avoiding being answerable. When they took the oath of office, they didn't say, oh, I will answer whenever I want to. I will use the law to avoid being accountable. They just said, I take this oath to uphold the Constitution. And upholding the Constitution includes being accountable to the owners of the Constitution, which is every citizen, every one of those 56 million people. The leadership, we discussed last year, leadership, that is the art of influencing and inspiring others to think and act in a particular way. And that it starts with leading yourself. So that's my experience as a person. And when my colleague Russell introduced me, I was hoping that you'd mention one thing. This is an advert. This is a self-advert for me now. The one thing that I was hoping you'd mention is that I summited Kilimanjaro last year. The relevance, though, thank you, the relevance of the summiting, though, is that I learned a lot there about self-leadership. That ultimately, as Edmund Hillary said, it's not the mountain out there that we conquer, it's the mountain in our head. And we either defeat it or win in our heads. And for me, I think that applies for us as individuals, it applies for us as families, it applies for us as organizations, it applies for us as a country and as a continent, that attitude that we have to win the battle within. So for me, that's why when I think of leadership, I don't just think it's the art of influencing and inspiring others, but it's also about influencing yourself to think and act in a particular way. And leadership is at the core of everything. I think John Maxwell is one who says that everything rises and falls with leadership. And that's not leadership by the president. It's something I learned in my own life. I recall when I worked in one government department where when a person like me at the level of a chief director, in fact, I was chief director transformation, which was important because transformation is about understanding that we inherited a particular system and including a particular leadership ethos, and we needed to create something new. But I would sit, thank you, I would sit with colleagues in our tea room complaining that our organization is dysfunctional because there's lack of leadership in this place. Have you been to a place like that? Where everyone complains about lack of leadership, whether it's a church or a stokvel or association or a country. And you say, until some consultant came and to us for a leadership workshop and said, when you say there's lack of leadership, you're chief directors and DDGs. Who's supposed to lead? If it's not your duty to lead, who's supposed to lead? And this person told us about a story that I think about NASA, that in NASA, when the cleaner was asked, what do you do here, sir? The cleaner didn't say, oh, I'm just a cleaner. The cleaner said, I'm helping to put the first man on the moon. So, but what does it mean? This cleaner understood that he is the leader. He's a janitor, he's a leader there, because when things go wrong in that small area, everything could fall apart. And I think it was Tiger Brands that got a lesson in that things don't always fall apart at the level of CEO or board. Just somebody not cleaning enough can cause a problem, and they had listeriosis, which has affected the total brand and the value of that brand, the equity of that brand. And so leadership becomes important as a country and as organizations to understand that we're all there to lead. And if there's leadership failure, that means we're all. Why do we need ethical governance? Because when ethics fail, governance fails, and when governance fails, things fall apart. We've seen that. I do want to say, though, dear colleagues, that when things fall apart, one of the crucial things that we lose is trust. For example, right now, I did a report when I was pop protector in a place called Olifantshoek. We struggled. In Kuruman, we were able to put the children back to school. In Kuruman, we struggled. But part of the problem was the question of lack of trust. And when we finally did an investigation, these people thought that the mayor had stolen 10 million. She hadn't stolen 10 million. It was an IDP, that's the Integrated Development Plan in the local government. They had a wish list that included 10 million for roads. But eventually that money was not assigned, but nobody knew that. But when there's a situation of lack of trust, everyone thinks somebody has stolen something. When people are appointed, we wonder, do they qualify? You just have that atmosphere of distrust. So it becomes important that people know that we do things the right way here, we do things transparently here, which is part of good governance, and they're not going to suspect us to be doing something wrong. State capture is another case, but for me, the issue of trust in state capture is, think about some of the people today who still think there's no state capture. It's an issue of trust, isn't it? Because not everyone understands how things are done. When somebody tells you there's no problem, it's them who are creating a problem, you may believe it. But again, it boils down to people who have been disappointed elsewhere, who feel that democracy is not working for us anyway, so why should we believe those who are saying we should enforce ethics? Because ethical governance has not worked for us. They tell us that there was ethical governance before Zuma. But before Zuma, my life didn't change. During Zuma, my life didn't change. Why should I care either way? It's a question of trust. So it becomes important that if we continue in an ethical way throughout, everyone is on board around the issue of trust. But I just wanted to give you two very recent examples. At Stellenbosch, we have something called the M Plan for Social Justice. And one of the key result areas of that is getting you and me to fund social justice. Or is that much better? Right. But a whole lot of people are initially skeptical to say, why should I pay more to fund social justice? We already overtaxed, and a lot of our money has gone to SABC and been wasted by SABC, it's been wasted by SAA, it's been wasted by ESCOM. They count many, many things that have squandered money. So that's lack of trust. In other words, even if now you have a legitimate purpose, because, for example, if you think about the M Plan, it's modeled against the Second World War II Europe Recovery Plan, where it was understood that even if there's good governance, 2 years into the Europe Recovery Program, it was clear that it was never going to achieve what it needed to achieve, because government's resources are primarily for maintenance. If you are dealing with a backlog, you need extra resources. So there has to be a way of galvanizing extra resources. So it's taking a lot of time to explain to people, okay, with the money that we're going to generate with the M Plan, we will make sure that the money that is already on the side of government is used properly. So one of the key result areas in the M Plan is something called social accountability. Interestingly, social accountability should have been part of democracy from day one. Me and you should not have discovered that Medupi is squandering millions well into the program, when now the money that has been, the time overruns have been crazy, the budget overruns are 3 times or 4 times. We should have discovered that through a transparent process. So social accountability is about empowering people to understand how the state runs, to participate in policy making, to participate in understanding how the system operates, to monitor the system on a day-to-day basis. So it's everyday justice in terms of how we're being governed. In so doing, we won't discover, as some people discover much later, that we were billed for a school that was going to be built in our community, but none has been built. We were billed for 200 RDP houses, but only 1 was built. Because if this social accountability, that is direct accountability to us as citizens, then we are supposed to monitor periodically. I mean, if somebody's building you a house and you're paying them for it, you don't come back the day they're supposed to hand over the key to you. You want to check, firstly, that the plans are correct, are as you want them to be, the house plan. You want to check at the level of the foundation, is it a sound foundation? Because if there's a structural defect, you'll ask them to take everything apart and start afresh. And then you will monitor the house as it moves and is moved. I think with democracy, the same thing applies when it comes to social accountability. And social accountability builds trust, and we've built that into the social justice thing. It's the same thing with land. When I tweeted, when somebody tweeted that Karen Moon wrote an article about a workshop that my colleague Zaza organized at the University of Stellenbosch, one of the responses was, why, after so much money has been stolen in land reform, why now is government planning to take our farms for free? So that's lack of trust, isn't it? The reality is that it's not a plan like that, that if your farm is functional and you acquired it properly, you paid your pension into that farm, it's going to be taken away. Never in a million years. That's not going to happen. But because of the climate of lack of trust, there is a sense that that could ever happen. Where's the playbook on ethics? It's the Constitution, Section 1, Section 195, 96, 136. I just want to remind you, maybe something I said last year, is that not everything that is lawful is ethical. Sometimes the law has a lower threshold than right and wrong, and we have to make sure that we do what is right. And for me, I always say that if it feels wrong, it must be wrong. That's how I ran my life up until now, and it helped me a lot when I was public protector. And what is the good governance architecture of South Africa? We have a transformative constitution. When we interpret that constitution, as Judge Cameron has said in the Daniels versus Kripante case, we must understand that built into that constitution is a formula for moving South Africa from what it used to be to a South Africa that embraces the humanity of everyone else. And in embracing the humanity of everyone else, there's also remedies. But part of the transformative part of our constitution is also ethics, is that it's not enough that we should be governed lawfully. We should also be governed ethically, and that's something politicians don't always remember, because they'll always say, I've never been declared a criminal by a court of law, therefore I'm fit to govern. No, you're not fit to govern if you have a history of being unethical. And Ben Turok is one person who stood for that understanding that as politicians, we must not just comply with lawfulness. We have to do the right thing because it's the right thing to do. And part of the right thing are things that are provided for in the Constitution. Codes of good practice, global and sector benchmarks. And then when it comes to how do we ensure there's a good governance framework, we have an implementation framework. There's different roles in government. There's parliament, there's There's parliament, there's the executive, the judiciary, and then there is institutions supporting democracy. In fact, a lot of us are beginning to think that we don't have 3 branches of government anymore. In South Africa, that the institutions supporting democracy are a branch on their own, but that's a discussion for another matter. And that brings me into enforcement mechanisms. When we think enforcement mechanisms and we say there must be good governance, every book you're going to read says we have to strengthen the capacity of the state. We have to strengthen policy certainty and resonance between the Constitution and policies. We have to also strengthen the enforcement mechanisms. I would like to just add, we have to strengthen the demos, the participation of the demos. A lot of the mistakes that happened in the past was that people were not fully engaged on a day-to-day basis. And if we can do anything, let's make sure that everyone from cleaner to king understands the mechanics of democracy and holds the system accountable. And we know the state of ethical governance has not been good, and we know that the state capture investigation has shown numerous lapses in ethical governance and in ethical leadership and good governance. But just when it comes to ethical leadership, we must also admit that we are at a point where ethical leadership is a challenge globally. People lie. In the past, when Selby Baqwa was public protector, Premier Ndaweni Mahlangu publicly said it's okay for a politician to lie. And Selby Baqwa investigated and said it was wrong to say it's okay to lie. So that was unethical. He said it's a violation of the Executive Ethics Code. Flip to 2020. We're no longer talking about is it right or wrong to lie, and is it right or wrong to say it's okay to lie. We're at a point where people lie every day. And we, the people, vote them in and out. And I think we must understand as American First Nations, or what they call them, American Indians say, the First Nations of America, they were saying that if you don't fix your torn dress, you'll soon be without a dress, because those are the dresses that unraveled. And so I think when it comes to the state of ethics in our country, it's not something that happened yesterday. There were lapses. And if we want to stop it, we need to stop it before it stops democratic processes. And that's not just in government, it's also in the private sector. Okay, I'm just going to end with one thing. What causes ethical lapses? One is an organizational defect, the other one is internally. At the level of organizational defect, I would say it's what do we reward as society? In our companies, in our organizations, do we always only reward those who deliver? I mean, there's a story that is told about King Nene, who needed an heir. It's this community, probably they didn't like girls because he only had girls, and they needed a boy to become his successor. He went around and asked the community to help him to find a boy who was going to succeed him. They ended up with 3 competent young men, and the competence was the same. It was difficult to choose. And then the king gave them the role of going to plant some seeds and give him fruit. All of them got 3 seeds. So the first one came back. They all had the same amount of time. The first one came back and said only 1 of the seeds bore a tree and fruit, yielded a tree and fruit. The second one came back and said all 3 yielded trees and fruit, and it's the best fruits in the world. The last one came back and told the king, sorry, sir, I did everything, but nothing happened. Who would he have appointed? The last one. Well, I mean, there's a lot of wisdom in this room, you can tell. But in companies, they're mostly likely to appoint number 2. because there's often just looking at results without looking at the process that yielded those results. In this particular case, yes, the King Nene appointed the last one because the test was the test for integrity. Because something built on integrity is built to last, whether it's your personal life, the family, a community, or a country. Built on it. But what it does mean, though, is that if something is built on integrity, it means it's not going to shoot to the stars in terms of advancement. It means it will take time to move forward. But when it does move forward, it will move sustainably. And so what causes ethical lapses is sometimes the desire for quick results. And increasingly, that's happening, instant gratification and the pressure to deliver. And we'll see more pressure to deliver now with jobs being shared, etc. And I would say advising people in government and companies is please don't yield to pressure to deliver at all costs when there'll be problems afterwards. Ethical dilemmas, the inability to sometimes to distinguish between right and wrong. At a personal level, I would say it's also from need to greed. Sometimes people do the wrong thing because there's a need, your company is about to collapse, and they say pay 10 million for the tender, and we can all work it out in that will inflate the price of the tender and everyone wins, so you lose nothing. But you lose your integrity. You lose sustainability also of your company, because then to keep performance of your company, you have to be corrupt. But one day you may be discovered. So often people, I've seen that happening. My final thoughts on what do we need to instill in government and civil society for ethical governance, for good governance and ethical governance. I would suggest what we call epic leadership. It's about being ethical, purpose-driven, impact-conscious, and committed to serve. So what can be done? It requires us to review our own thinking at a personal level. For me, I am always thinking, in what way am I part of the problem, and in what way am I part of the solution? Instead of just always pointing fingers out there. Then institutional reform, we will have to clean out state capture. We have to clean out our institutions, because although we may have rooted the head of state capture, but there are roots, there are branches that are poisoned. And then lastly, good citizenship. We need to advance social cohesion, and I also do think we need to invest in social justice to make sure that people don't weaponize poverty and inequality. Because we want ethics. People are saying, okay, maybe being good doesn't pay, and I might as well support unethical work if it gives me the crumbs. Lastly, dear colleagues, thank you for this privilege, and thank you for subjecting yourselves to this summer school. And I trust that whatever we learn together here is something that then gets translated to friends, colleagues, and others to make sure that ultimately we have the kind of thinking and leadership in society that will yield the democracy we want. Because ultimately, every generation has a unique opportunity and responsibility to identify and decisively address the challenges of its time. On our time, the SDGs talk about poverty, inequality, and climate change. But the issue of a return to integrity, a return to ethics, is also one of the challenges of our time. Thank you. Oh, yes. Hi, dear colleagues, we only have maybe about 10 minutes or so for questions. Any questions? Yes, sir.
Advocate Madonsela, thank you very much for your presentation. You defined for us the architecture of good governance in South Africa.
Yes.
And in big, bold letters at the bottom, you had the people.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. I like that. I like that you've already given me a leeway, sir. Any democracy is going to yield what the people want, because they say we get the government we want. How do we make sure that people understand that? I would say the first thing is democracy literacy. Just talking about us in our small way, as Stellenbosch University and as Tuma Foundation. At Stellenbosch University, we've got something that we call a social justice cafe. And it's an event that takes place every second month, and we invite mostly students to talk about issues around social justice. But at the core of that is the democratic architecture and your role as a citizen. And at the end of the day, we're always talking about what about you, what about us, what about they? And the Tuma Foundation also, they do democracy literacy and leadership kind of public engagements and training. And again, at the end of the day, is asking people to think about what's your role. For example, we had a project called Dear Presidents. We asked young people to look at what kind of democracy they would like to live in, what kind of world would they like to live in, and which leaders do they want to engage with to reconcile what the leaders were doing and the democracy these young people want. We also, though, asked the young people to say, what are you doing personally to move the needle towards the direction that you want democracy? So I think for me it's engagement, literacy, and encouraging people to understand you have the power, take it back. Thank you, sir. Another question? Yes, ma'am.
I'd like to just stand up here and give a personal standing ovation that you gave us in the darkest times of state capitalism. My personal standing ovation, and anybody else can join.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, sir. Thank you. Thank you, ma'am. That's very kind. And my only request to you and to everyone else is to say we've eliminated some of the wrongdoing and taken some of the wrongdoers out of the system. But to anchor democracy, we'll now have to work together around the areas of ethics and the area of social justice, because they weaponize social justice. They weaponize poverty. They say, you're poor because somebody else is rich. And I'm not saying people are not poor because partly it's a legacy of the past. But the problem at the moment is that everything then gets blamed on the past. Corruption is not taken care of. Bad governance is not taken care of. But what we need to do from our part is to show people we care. And therefore, we invite you to be part of the M Plan for Social Justice. And thank you, ma'am. Any other question? Yes, sir.
One of the big elephants of the room, of course, is climate change. It provides an example of something which is not certain in the future, the consequences of it. And I guess the impression the governments avoid it because there's no short-term benefit in them for doing something about it. How do you handle that sort of problem?
Thank you, sir. And I think it boils down, sir, to good governance, because good governance is the interface between the citizen and those who are entrusted with power. And how do we as citizens ignite action at the level of government? Because I do agree with you that, firstly, our government has not been vocal about SDGs generally. And yet SDGs, that is Sustainable Development Goals, are supposed to be a catalyst for change. As a country, we embarked on this system of change in the last 25 years, and we must admit as a country, like everyone else, that we've reached a plateau of some sort. And the whole world has been given SDGs as a catalyst for change, and We need to hear more. We need to hear more noise around it, and we need to find a way of galvanizing all of the active 58 million people of South Africa. I'm saying 58 because some of them are small, some of them are infirmed, but a good 20 million people should be able to do something about SDGs and about climate change. And you've hit the nail in the head, say, about climate change. Human beings just tend to solve crises. And also we tend also, if you look at people who win awards, its tendency is those who won awards, who rescued us from some kind of crisis. So in South Africa, we haven't really felt yet the impact of climate change. Although if you're coming from Stellenbosch this morning, like we do, you'll understand the impact of climate change. I would say the starting point is use our power, those who have companies, to include climate change education in our human awareness education. Those companies that just teach people social education in companies, we should include the issues of climate change. In churches, just a bit about climate change, but also to understand to people, for people to understand that it's not true that it's not an immediate threat. The kinds of levels of exposure to the sun are already being linked to certain skin cancers, too much radiation, etc. It's not going to be the kind of crisis you got in Mozambique and in Malawi and a little bit in Durban. That will be our unmaking. The problem is creeping on us. I would say we need to include it in our dinner conversations as well. Just beyond just talking about what's going wrong with state capture and corruption, maybe deliberately include a card there on what are we going to do about climate change? Yes. But I think we also need to petition our government to galvanize the whole nation around what's South Africa's response to climate change as a nation. Thank you, sir. Yes, sir. I agree entirely, Say. I'm not sure. I think you're probably right about the landing on the moon, that maybe the mission itself might not have been inspired by good motives, but at the end of the day, that landing on the moon has increased our understanding of where we are, who we are, and the broader environment within which we exist. And then